Have you ever tried really hard to persuade someone only to feel them pulling further and further away from you? Maybe you explained your point brilliantly, and maybe you had all the facts at your fingertips, and maybe you were absolutely right. And yet somehow, the more you pushed, the less they seemed to listen. If that's ever happened to you, you're not alone. Because in this video, I'm going to share 3 steps you can take to be more persuasive. And honestly, they're probably not what you think. Most people think that persuasion is about having the best arguments and also having the sharpest logic and the most convincing words. But often, persuasion works better when people don't feel pushed at all. I'm Shola Kaye, and I'm an author and speaker. I help people communicate with more confidence, with more empathy, and also with greater impact. And one of the big changes that I want to share today is this. If you want to be more persuasive, stop thinking only about your message and start thinking more about the other person. That's one of the reasons that I sometimes talk about the other lens. And what I mean by the other lens is there's the self, there's the others around us, and then there's our environment. And quite often we just think about ourselves and our environment, but we forget to think about the other people that are involved. And if you are interested a little bit in that particular model, it's something called emotional audacity, and I talk about it some more in other YouTube videos and on my webpage. But let's go back to this. So in simple terms, it's a reminder to ask, what does the other person need? What might they be feeling? What's making this hard for them? Because persuasion isn't just about expressing ourselves, it's also about connecting with the other person. So here are 3 ways that we can be more persuasive. The first is to listen more than you think you need to. And this is one that people often skip. We think that persuasion starts when we speak and it's all about us doing the talking. But actually, it often starts when we listen. Because when somebody resists an idea, it's normally their way of telling us that they have some useful information that they haven't told us yet, right? Maybe they're uncertain, maybe they feel overlooked, maybe they're worried about some kind of risk being involved, maybe they just don't want to be pushed and they're quite obstinate, right? So if you jump in too quickly and in too forceful a way, especially with something like yes, but, or yeah, but you need to hear what I'm saying, they will feel corrected rather than understood. In his book, How to Change Anyone's Mind, Jonah Berger argues that when people feel pushed, they often push back harder, and that reducing resistance matters more than piling on more and more pressure. So instead of rushing in, slow down. Try something like, tell me more about what's making you hesitate. Or you could say something like, what's your main concern here? And listening does a couple of things. First, it gives you better information. And secondly, it helps the other person to feel respected. And people are much more open to influence when they don't feel that they're being bulldozed. The second thing that you can do to be more persuasive is ask questions instead of cornering people. And this is such a powerful shift. A lot of us try to persuade by making more statements. And here's why this is a good idea, or here's why you should do this, or this happened to me before, and this is what I learned, so you should do the same thing. So here's why your concern doesn't really stand up. That's another one. But questions can work much better. Why is that? Well, it's because questions involve thought, right? If we are asking people questions, they have to start thinking deeper. And they also create space. They help people participate in the conclusion rather than just defending themselves against whatever conclusion that we have and whatever we're trying to push upon them. So one of Jonah Berger's ideas is that questions can reduce arguing and increase buy-in because the other person starts getting in touch with their own answer rather than preparing their next objection to our pushing. So instead of saying, this is definitely the best way forward, you want to say something like, what would make this feel workable for you? Or what's most important to you in this discussion? Or you could say, what would need to be true for you to feel comfortable with this? That's a very, very different energy. And you're not cornering them anymore. You're actually guiding them. And often people are much more persuaded by the conclusions they reach themselves than by the ones that we give them or the ones that we push upon them. The third reason or the third strategy that you can use to be more persuasive is to actually be more empathetic. And I talk about empathy a lot. I work as primarily a keynote speaker on empathy and, as I said, communication. And people often think empathy is weak, it's soft, but it's not. Empathy is really strong, right? So now being empathetic doesn't mean that you become really vague or you back away from your point. Sometimes people think that being empathetic means that you agree with everything that everyone else says and you forget your own opinion. So we're not asking you to do that. In this particular case, it means understanding that resistance is often emotional before it's logical. So somebody may not be resisting because your idea is weak or it doesn't work. Instead, they might be resisting because change feels uncomfortable to them, or because they're tired, because they feel exposed, because they're worried about what this means for them going forward. There's a lot of reasons, right? So empathy helps you spot that. And so when you do, your persuasion actually gets better, right? Because your message lands more effectively because you actually understand what's going on for them rather than it all being about what's going on for you. So instead of just thinking, how do I get them to agree? You start asking, well, what's it like to be on the receiving end of this particular conversation? What's going on for them right now emotionally and in their heads? And that is what I call the other lens from this model I talked about, emotional audacity, which is considering other people, considering their thoughts, considering what's going on for them, rather than it all being about you. So, what might the impact be on them is another question. What pressures are they under? What might they need from me right now to help them move forward? So it could be that you need to acknowledge the emotions that they're feeling before you move on to talking about a next step. And that might look like you saying, I can see why that might feel like a big shift for you. Or, you know what, it sounds as though there's a real concern about the timing here. Or another thing might be, I'm not asking you to ignore the risks, but I would just like us to think about what would make this easier. So those sorts of questions really help. And empathy, when we show that we understand the other person, they become much less defensive. And when defensiveness drops, then our persuasion becomes easier. So those are three reasons or three strategies really to help you become more persuasive. And if you'd like to be more persuasive, remember this, that it's not always about pushing harder, but it's often about reducing their resistance. And you can do that by listening more. You can do that by asking better questions, and you can do it by being more empathetic. It doesn't make you soft, doesn't make you weak. It makes you more effective. And also people will warm to you if you show empathy, you listen, you ask questions versus just pushing your own agenda on them. So real persuasion isn't about winning in the moment. It's actually about a win-win situation, helping people move forward. If you'd like more tools on communication, empathy, confidence, then please go to sholakaye.com/everything. And there you'll find some of my downloads and access to other information. And also you can learn about working with me if you're a group or an organization. That's sholakaye.com/everything. Thanks and see you for the next one.